Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today we're going to talk about this paper called E Pluribus Unum, Diversity and Community in the 21st Century. And you might have heard of this paper. It's pretty famous if you're interested in immigration and diversity and its effects on society. But this paper was published in 2007 by Robert Putnam, who's a well-known and well-regarded social scientist and diversity researcher. And this particular paper, it's part review article, part original research. So he starts by giving an overview of the results of many other studies in the field of diversity research. And then he gives some original data and does his own study in this paper also. So we're going to talk about all that. Just more background, because this paper is a little bit controversial in terms of some of its information. It's important to restate that this is a well-renowned diversity researcher, and this paper has been cited extensively, over 8,000 times, which if you don't know, that's very rare that you get an academic publication cited that often. Usually, academic publications are getting a few dozen citations or something pretty low. So this is a very well-respected study in the field. Okay, and again, this researcher, Robert Putnam, he's also very well respected in the field. Okay, so he was at Harvard. He was a Harvard professor, and he grew up in New York, converted to Judaism. I think that might be relevant because I think, as we'll see, his views on immigration have probably been influenced by his religious views. Okay, so we're going to go through this paper. Like I said, the first part, it's kind of like a review article, so he's summarizing other people's research, but then he gives some of his own research toward the middle, and then toward the end, it's a lot of discussing the implications of this from his perspective. All right, so he starts off by talking about how ethnic diversity is increasing in most advanced countries. Of course, we know that's mostly in European countries and countries of European ancestry, because of mass immigration, which we've talked about before. Okay, he says immigration and diversity might have important benefits in the long run, which we'll talk about. But he says in the short run, it's almost all harmful. So it reduces social solidarity and basically social functioning in society, as we're going to talk about. He uses this phrase, hunker down. So he says that evidence is showing that diversity basically causes people to hunker down, which he means they basically shut themselves off from society. They become more reclusive. They don't really participate in public life. They don't volunteer. They don't participate in like government organizations and things like that. They sort of shut themselves off. Okay. And they have lower trust. They have lower altruism and fewer friends, and they're lonelier and so on. So we're going to talk about both the supposed positives of diversity and the negatives. Okay, it's worth noting that this paper, it's about diversity broadly speaking. So that includes like economic diversity, so low-class people, high-class people. It includes age diversity, but he mostly focuses on racial and ethnic diversity because of that. Of course, that's the one with the biggest implications. All right. So again, now getting into the introduction, he talks about how we can be extremely certain that in the future, most advanced countries are going to be more diverse than they are right now. And again, by that, he just means, people from different races and ethnicities are moving into most advanced countries, specifically countries with European ancestry. Okay. He gives a little bit of background, and he goes on to talk about how the social environment that children grow up in is extremely important, which is relevant because, as we're going to see, diversity basically harms the social environment. But he says it's very important that children have an optimal social environment to grow up in, because then children are healthier, they're safer, they're better educated, they live longer, they're happier, the economy works better, the government functions better. But then he goes on to say, later that we'll talk about, diversity basically ruins the social functioning of a society, at least in the short term. So all of these benefits of a good social environment are basically threatened whenever diversity increases. Okay, and I guess before I get too far into it, I should note that this author, he's very pro-diversity and he's pro-immigrant. So he spent decades researching diversity, and I think it's safe to say he was disappointed to find that diversity is basically universally harmful. Okay, again, at least in the short term and at the local level. So, he's unhappy that he has to admit that diversity seems to be bad in most cases. All right. So, again, he talks about how diversity is going to increase, might be good in the long run, but bad in the short term. So what does he mean by good in the long run? Okay. Well, some of his supposed benefits of immigration are, one, he says creativity seems to be increased by immigration and diversity. So he talks about how if you look at America's Nobel Prize winners and various other like academic accolades, immigrants are disproportionately receiving those. Okay, but I think if you take a step back and look at like European civilization as a whole, we don't exactly have a dearth of creativity. In other words, if you look at Europeans throughout history, back when they were more racially and ethnically homogenous in those countries, we had no problem with creativity and technological advancement and things like that. So, maybe it is true that immigration and diversity increase creativity, but do we need that much more creativity in our societies? Or I think we were probably fine alone without that. And it's worth pointing out that academia, which is supposedly the domain looking for thought diversity, as everyone knows, they're not interested in thought diversity at all. They stifle that at every chance. So, for example, conservatives on academic campuses or in academic environments, their thoughts are not even entertained, and in fact, they are punished extensively for having those. I could tell you that firsthand, and maybe we can cover some empirical research to that effect on future videos. But academics, they're not actually interested in thought diversity. If they were, they wouldn't be stifling everybody who wasn't a liberal. But I think this is like this immigration enhances creativity. That's sort of like a pretext that left-wing academics hold on to in order to retain their pro-diversity stance. When in reality, one, do we really need more creativity? And two, is academia really interested in thought diversity? I don't think so. So, I'm suspicious that this is even a true benefit or that it's worth it. Okay, he says immigration is generally associated with more rapid economic growth. Okay, that one I don't really dispute. I don't think that's really debated. Rapid economic growth in terms of GDP, of course, that's just based on like consumption. So of course that's going to be increased when there's more people. So in that sense, if you bring more people in, it's definitely going to grow the economy by that metric. However, the effect of immigration on the economic well-being of like normal people, that is more debated and more complicated because there's a lot of factors that go into it. So for example, immigrants, first of all, it depends on the type of immigrant. Are they high skill? Are they low skill? Are they legal or illegal? Are they paying taxes or not? All of that influences whether or not they're contributing positively to the economy. Are they a net welfare like recipient or are they a net contributor? So it varies by immigrant. So for example, you consider like a normal immigrant who comes here and they get a job. Most immigrants are willing to work for less than native-born workers because they're often coming from underdeveloped countries, and so they're willing to accept a lower standard of living, which means they'll accept lower pay for the same work. Okay, and so that might have a benefit in some sense because if the employees are working for less, then the company can produce the product cheaper, which in theory means they could sell it to like us for cheaper, and then our products that we buy would be less expensive. But you also have to consider the other side of that coin, which is if immigrants are coming here and they're able to work for less money, then that basically floods the labor pool and therefore makes it more difficult for Americans to find high-paying jobs and puts like downward pressure on wages. So there's that to consider. More immigrant workers means more production, which would mean higher supply of products, which would mean lower prices. But more people, more immigrants, also means higher demand for products, which means higher demand, which means higher prices. Okay, so it's not as straightforward and simple as a lot of people want to think it is. But I'm willing to accept that there might be economic benefits of immigration. But still, I don't think it's worth it. Again, our standard of living, or at least our cost of living, is much higher now than it was when America was more homogenous. So I don't really think you could argue that our increased diversity is correlated with a lower cost of living. Okay, this next point that he raises, he says that immigration is important for aging populations because when populations age, the people retire. When they retire, they're a net drain on society financially because you have to pay for their like medical care and things like that. And there's not enough young people to labor in order to support those aging people in terms of like having a large labor pool to tax for the government so that way they can get revenue to fund these government programs related to medicine. So they need immigrants to both do the actual work of taking care of these elderly people and also to be taxable to fund the care for these elderly people. Okay? And that's another genuine benefit of immigration. In other words, this is a true problem that we have in European countries. We have a top-heavy population curve where most, the aging population is higher than the younger population because we have sub-replacement fertility rates. So, again, I think we could get through that without immigration. It might make the economy worse for a period of time, but it's worth it because, as we're going to talk about, the dangers of immigration are much, much greater than these supposed benefits. And then the last benefit of immigration that he mentions is that immigrants coming from the global south, so that's like Africa, South America, South Asia, going to the global north, mostly like Europe and North America, he says that's beneficial to the people of the global south. Basically, it helps the global south develop more because, one, when they come here and they work, they send a portion of their earnings back to their home country. That's remittances. But then also they transfer technology and ideas back to their home countries, thus boosting those countries. So again, there's no debate that immigration from like the global south, the third world, to the first world is certainly beneficial to the third world because, they get all of our stuff. All right. So then he talks about how immigration and diversity have been approached in academia. So he says, some researchers have come up with what's called the contact hypothesis, which basically that's the idea that when people come into contact with diversity, like ethnic diversity and racial diversity, it makes us less hostile toward the outgroup. In other words, whenever we come into contact with other people who are different than us, we basically become more accepting of them because we see that they're not that bad, and we become more tolerant of them. So that's one line of thinking regarding diversity. Diversity basically makes people more tolerant of diversity. All right, and the idea is that it would reduce, exposure to diversity would reduce ethnocentric tendencies, and it would make people more accepting of the outgroup. As we'll see, this turns out not to really be true. So he says right here, for progressives, the contact theory is alluring, but I think it's fair to say that most, if not all, or rather though not all, empirical studies have tended to instead support the so-called conflict theory, which suggests that for various reasons, mostly contention over limited resources, diversity fosters out-group distrust and in-group solidarity. In other words, there's this alternative theory to the contact theory, which is called the conflict theory. And this theory is that more exposure to diversity basically leads to more racial conflict and ethnocentrism. And that's the one that seems to be borne out by the evidence. And I think, most of us living in societies whose demographics are changing rapidly, we recognize this. Okay, mass immigration is causing cultural conflict throughout Europe, throughout America. Okay, more diversity does not mean more peace. I think it's actually, in hindsight, it's silly that we as academics or people ever really even thought that. All right. So now he lists off a bunch of observations that people have made in the literature about diversity and its effects. So he says, across work groups in the United States and in Europe, it's been shown that internal heterogeneity, which basically just means diversity, is associated with lower group cohesion, lower job satisfaction, and higher job turnover. In other words, people don't stay at the job for a long time. Evidently, they don't like it, so they come and they leave quickly. And they're not satisfied with their job. So diversity lowers job satisfaction. Across countries, greater ethnic heterogeneity, again, ethnic diversity, is associated with lower social trust, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Okay, that matters because remember at the beginning of the paper, all the beneficial effects of a positive social environment helps children grow up to be healthier and live longer lives and to be happier and things like that. He says, across local areas in these various European countries and European ancestry countries, greater ethnic diversity is associated with lower social trust and, at least in some cases, lower investment in public goods, which we'll talk more about that later too. But basically, people are less willing to invest in their community if their community is populated by people who are not of their kin and group. And that just makes sense. You don't want to give your resources to outsiders who are going to take it from you. In this result here that he's referencing, he says that ethnic diversity has been associated with higher default rates on loans. In other words, people don't repay their loans as well in higher diversity societies. Okay, and this one, he says, greater ethnic diversity is associated with less voluntary fundraising in this Kenyan school. Okay, so it's not just in European societies where diversity is harmful. Right? He says in Pakistan, religious, clan, and political diversity are linked with failure of collective infrastructure maintenance. Okay? So I don't know specifically what that's referring to in this case, but things like maintaining your roads and maintaining the basic structures of your society, like that's more difficult in areas that are more diverse. Again, that signifies people aren't able to cooperate as well toward a common goal. Okay? Ethnic diversity in America associated with lower carpooling. That's relevant because that's a practice that indicates trust and willingness to reciprocate. So this is a signifier of low trust again. In experimental games, in high diversity settings, so people are more willing to cheat. So that again suggests that people aren't trusting each other whenever they're from diverse backgrounds or different backgrounds. All right. He talks about even if you look all the way back at like the Civil War, the Union armies in America, he says that in companies in the Union Army that had greater diversity, they had a higher desertion rate. So people are less willing to sacrifice their life for people who are not in their same group, which again, that just makes sense. And I think that's just natural. Okay. So all of this strongly suggests that diversity has negative social effects. There's more that we'll talk about later. Okay. So he goes on to talk a little bit more about this. Okay. So here he talks about how most researchers, they assume that if your out-group solidarity decreases, that would mean your in-group solidarity increases. So in other words, what he means by this is most people assume that if you're not favorable toward people who are different than you, that means you are favorable toward people who are in your group. But he says it's possible that diversity reduces both in-group and out-group solidarity. It makes people less accepting of other people in their group and people outside their group. So it lowers trust and solidarity for both groups. And he goes on to test that in a minute, and we'll talk about it. But he calls this, or he gets from his colleague, this is the constrict theory. Okay, the idea that diversity harms both your in-group relationships and out-group relationships. And long story short, it turns out that seems to be true. So now he does his own research here. So he takes data from this nationwide survey. So this is in America. And, it's carried out in the year 2000. It has 30,000 individuals who were surveyed. And it basically covers like where they live as well as their views on, different social issues related to this paper. So you can read the methods if you want. We're going to skip straight to the results. Okay. It's worth saying that here you get some of this, a little bit of a window into the mentality of academics regarding race and ethnicity. So he basically says, for the purposes of this study, we categorize race as Hispanic, non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, and Asian. He says that this classification scheme is a social construct. In other words, it's not biological. But I think that that's foolish in light of everything we know about population genetics and genetic anthropology and things like that. To believe that race and ethnicity are like completely distinct from biology and like independent of biology, I don't think that's tenable today. So I think that's another thing we'll look back on I think we look back on it now and recognize that it was foolish. But in 50 years, I think we'll look back on that and be confused as to how we ever believed that to be true. Clearly, race is not a social construct. Okay. And this is the first graph. And what it's showing is that on the x-axis, this is basically ethnic homogeneity. So each dot in this graph is a different city in the United States. And along the x-axis, that's plotting how homogeneous that city is by ethnicity. And again, this was from data from 2000. Obviously, the demographics have changed significantly since 2000. Okay, but on the y-axis, this is showing how much the people in those cities trust other races besides their own. And what's interesting is that the more homogeneous the city is, the more likely the members are to say that they trust other races a lot. And so what that means is, without having ever been really exposed to the other races as much, they are more willing to trust other races. Whereas once they become exposed, aka on the left-hand side, these cities where it's extremely racially diverse, those people say they're less willing to trust other races. So it seems to suggest that when you're exposed to diversity, you become less trusting of people of other races. Whereas if you're not exposed to diversity, you're almost naive and don't feel as though you should be distrusting of other races. Okay, so that seems to support the conflict theory, where the more diversity you're exposed to, the less you like diversity. All right. So he says that here. The more ethnically diverse the people we live around, the less we trust them. That's what was shown up above. Okay. Now, interesting. This is where it gets interesting. And this is showing, again, it's basically set up the same way, where each dot is a city. The x-axis is, once again, the ethnic homogeneity of that city. But the y-axis this time, it's how much do you trust your neighbors? And what you see is, once again, there's a positive relationship. So more homogeneous cities, they're more trusting of their neighbors, whereas more diverse cities, they're less trusting of their neighbors. Now, this is important because most people in America, their neighbors tend to be people of a similar ethnicity to them. So this is suggesting that exposure to diversity might just make you less trusting of other people in general, not just people of other races. Okay? So in more diverse communities, people trust their neighbors less. All right. Now, here we go. This is the big one. Again, it's set up the same way. So on the x-axis, that's homogeneity of that city by ethnicity. And the y-axis is how much the people in that city trust their own race. And again, the more homogenous it is, the more people trust their own race. Whereas the more diverse the city, the less they're willing to trust their own race. So again, this suggests that the constrict theory was probably right, where greater exposure to diversity just basically produces less trust overall. Okay? So he says here, diversity seems to trigger not in-group or out-group division, but enemy or social isolation. So basically he says the people, they enter this hunker down mode and they pull in like a turtle, basically meaning they seclude themselves off socially. They don't really participate with other people, and they become distrusting and things like that. And so all of that was some of his research being reported here. He goes on then to discuss other results that have been found. So he says that in areas of greater diversity, respondents of previous studies have demonstrated lower confidence in the local government, local leaders, and the local news media. So greater diversity means you're not confident in your government. Greater diversity is associated with lower feelings of political efficacy, the belief that they can make a change in their environment. People in diverse areas, they register to vote less frequently. And even though they're less willing to register to vote, they're more interested in politics because they're unhappy, okay? They want to see a political change in their situation, but they don't believe in voting. They don't believe that voting can get them out of their situation. They're more likely to participate in protests and things like that. Okay, we don't need to worry too much about this figure. Okay, but people in diverse societies and diverse environments, they also have less expectation that others will cooperate to solve dilemmas of collective action. So in other words, they don't believe that the people around them will work together to solve a common problem. People are less likely to work on a community project in diverse society. They're lower likelihood of giving to charity or volunteering in a diverse society. They have fewer close friends, fewer people they can confide in. They have lower happiness. They have lower quality of life. And they have more time spent watching television, and agree that television is their most important form of entertainment. Okay, so basically everyone's being turned into socially isolated people because of diversity. Okay, he goes on to say that diversity does not produce bad race relations. I think that's not true. I think, again, anybody who's paying attention to the cultural conflict brought about by mass immigration would say otherwise. People are becoming more racially conscious, and race relations are definitely souring. So again, this is from 2007, so this paper's a bit dated. I think diversity is proven time and time again to produce bad race relations. Okay. But he does say that inhabitants of diverse communities tend to withdraw from collective life, to distrust their neighbors, regardless of the color of their skin, have fewer close friends, they expect the worst from their community, they volunteer less, they give less to charity, basically everything we just described. So he says diversity, at least in the short term, seems to bring out the turtle in all of us. Okay. So he also then goes on to try to come up with other explanations. You know, is it truly ethnic diversity, or is ethnic diversity associated with something else that people find unpleasant? So he says, you know, diverse communities do tend to be larger. They tend to be less egalitarian, so less equality. He says that they tend to be more crime-ridden and things like that. So maybe some of those factors influence it. But as we'll talk about, he goes on to basically correct for all of this. And it's just diversity itself is a problem. But diverse environments, you know, those communities, they tend to be poorer, they're less educated, they have lower home ownership, they are less likely to speak English. So the idea is maybe some of these other factors explain the relationship between diversity and social dysfunction. Okay, but he corrected for all of those factors and more. So what Table 3 is showing is he basically attempts to correct for all of those different factors. So through statistical methods that we don't need to get into, he basically was able to isolate out these different variables and remove them from consideration. And then he could look at each individual variable on its own and its relationship to trust in neighbors. So if you look at age, for example, the way that you interpret this table is this column here under B. That's basically the slope of the relationship between this factor in the row and trust in neighbors. And so there's a slight positive relationship between age of the person being surveyed and their trust in their neighbors. So older people are more willing to trust their neighbors. Okay, people who own their home, they're more willing to trust their neighbors. However, if you look down here, people who are in poverty, they're much less willing to trust their neighbors. So poverty negatively affects it. Okay, being black ethnicity, that negatively affects trust in neighbors. So those people are less willing to trust their neighbors. People who have a Latino ethnicity, they have lower trust in their neighbors. Okay, but the big one here is, again, this analysis is showing just how diverse ethnically is their environment and how does that impact trust in neighbors. All of these other factors have been statistically corrected for and basically removed from the analysis in this case. And what you see is that the more ethnically homogeneous the person's environment is, the more they're willing to trust their neighbors. Okay, so the point of this table is you can correct for all of these different factors and remove them from the analysis. Diversity itself is related to trust. Okay, it's not just poverty, it's not just crime, it's not just any of these things. Okay, diversity itself mediates the effect. Okay, so then we're going to skip most of what comes next, but he basically goes on to look at alternative explanations that people have given. So in other words, all of his results so far, for the most part, have suggested that diversity is harmful to the social fabric of society. So other researchers have noticed this and, of course, have a problem with this because academia is very pro-diversity. And so these are potential other explanations that other academics have given. And this author basically goes through and argues against each of those. So we're not going to go through it, but if you're curious, there are other explanations people have attempted to offer for why diversity is associated with lower social functioning. Okay, but this author, who's very pro-diversity, doesn't find them compelling for the reasons that he articulates here. Okay, so we're going to skip most of this. There's some interesting things in there, though. So, for example, he says that looking at people of different age groups, all Americans, regardless of their age, for the most part, seem to be bothered by diversity to roughly the same extent. So he says, Americans raised in the 1970s seem fully as unnerved by diversity as those raised in the 1920s. In other words, people are not fully becoming like more welcoming of diversity. They're still bothered by it. He says, we have unearthed no convincing evidence of generational differences in reactions to diversity. So he goes on to discuss a few other potential explanations. So one was that, maybe homogenous areas, they have more schools, libraries, and like even playgrounds and daycare facilities and things like that. And maybe that's why those people are more trusting. They're more socially engaged. Well, that turns out not to be true, actually. It turns out that more diverse areas have more of those community resources. So it's not different access to social activities in different areas responsible for diversity's negative effect on social functioning. Okay, it must be something else. All right. So to summarize that whole section, he says here, in short, we have tried to test every conceivable artifactual explanation for our core finding, and yet the pattern persists. In other words, they tried to correct for every possible alternative explanation for these results, for why diversity is associated with social dysfunction. And, it's not an artifact of the data, meaning not like a non-real effect produced by a bad method. Okay, it's true. Americans today are uncomfortable with diversity. And again, I could have told you that. Okay, so in here he was talking about how he eventually wants to write a bigger essay and do a larger project on how we can make diversity work. So again, it's all very frustrating because he presents all this data about the problem of diversity and how it's causing social dysfunction and trust issues and all kinds of problems in our society. And rather than say we need to have less diversity, he instead says we need extensive interventions to make diversity work. And so for him, this basically just means being more inclusive and broadening our sense of we, he says. So creating a more expansive identity and then welcoming more people in. So he does talk about a few other suggestions, like offering national aid to certain locations in the United States to encourage diversification. Of course, I think that's a terrible idea. He talks about the need for more social groups like the Jewish Immigrant Aid Societies to help integrate immigrants and bring more here, essentially, to enhance the diversity of European nations in America. But other than that, that's basically the paper in a nutshell. So the main takeaway from this paper is just that diversity has many negative consequences, especially social consequences. And the supposed benefits of diversity: one, there aren't that many. Two, not all of them are certain. In other words, there's a lot of debate about, for example, the economic benefits and things like that, and the creativity benefits. But I would say that the main takeaway is simply that diversity is overwhelmingly negative, and if we're going to survive as a civilization, we need to resist the efforts to make our countries more diverse, because that's going to destroy the social fabric of our society. So, thank you for listening.